So let's begin. I call the meeting to order. This is the May 28th, 2024 meeting of the 2229 Main Street Advisory Task Force. I'm the chair, Paul Bohm, and we can start by calling the roll. Carrie,
Everybody's here.
Rich,
Here.
Feely, Court Booth,
Here.
Pam Hill,
Here.
Kurt Herman,
Here.
Gary Clement,
Here.
Carl Seidman,
Here.
and Paul Bohm. I'm here. Gary and Carl are on Zoom. Everybody else is in person. Welcome to others who are attending tonight. So the agenda, let me just share the agenda. We have two main topics. Well, actually, three. We have a couple of minutes to approve. The main topic is that Rue Associates is here tonight to discuss the results of the risk work that they have done, and where they are in that whole process. We have a public forum next Tuesday. Can't believe it's that soon, June 4th. And I want to discuss the public forum, starting with the revised slides that are in the meeting packet, but I think more importantly, the whole process of the public forum, and then we'll go to public comment and adjourn. So let's start with the minutes. So we have, there's one set of minutes in your packet. That's the May 7th regular session minutes. And then we have the executive session to discuss it separately. So on the regular session minutes, hope you've had a chance to review that. Any comments or questions or edits on the May 7th regular session?
Another great job as I read them.
Agree.
It's Rich Feely doing this thing. Amongst other things that he does.
Never mind.
Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Yes.
Second.
Okay, just a roll call for approval. Harry,
I
Rich,
Aye.
Kurt,
Aye.
Pam.
I also was out of the country, so I abstained.
Okay,
Was there?
Kurt.
I understand.
I say aye, and Carl
Aye.
and Gary.
Aye, yeah.
Okay, so the minutes of May 7th are approved. So we have the executive session minutes, which I shared with you individually. I'm not going to put them up on the screen. It's not part of the meeting packet. I've gotten one comment from that, a minor comment from Kurt. So a modifier, removing an adjective. But it's a minor addition. Are there any, if there are any changes we can discuss here, grammar, etc., that's fine. If there's any substance, you probably have to get those to me, but
I will comment on mine because there's something to, but I did make a comment that you, I think, addressed in the executive session.
right, and I think we revised
Accordingly.
accordingly. So the minutes you have for approval of the executive session are revised based on Pam's comments. Kurt,
Are you suggesting approval but not release?
yes, we're approving it tonight. We're not going to release them yet. We'll have to vote on
One adjective change.
with one adjective change. And the adjective changes from the removal of the word likely. Doesn't change the substance of the sentence, so just for that. So yes, we are approving the minutes, but we are not releasing them. We will have to vote separately later on when we're ready to release those minutes, when the subject matters up for public, to public knowledge and discussion.
Move to approve the minutes with that one change.
Paul,
To be
Paul,
released at this time.
Yes, up, Carl, I'm sorry, Mr. Hand.
I had one minor suggestion. I emailed you, but maybe I didn't see it, but on page 3, let's see if I could find it. Here we go. See if I can find it. Oh yeah, on page 3, the I think the fourth paragraph down, It says, however, acquiring only portions of the site seem unlikely since EPA wants to transfer the land to a single responsible party. And I was thinking maybe say single responsible owner, just because the term responsible party in the Superfund context has a specific meaning and that might get misinterpreted.
Yeah, the sentence sort of is an in progress sentence. It speaks the EPA transfer to somebody else. It's not an ownership. I could go with either, whether it's
He's
party.
right, he's right about that, responsible party is a term of art.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
You're correct. It should be,
It's a term of art.
that's, you are correct. I forgot the context of this whole task force.
To say, we did two changes.
Okay,
And I guess my change
let's
was
go.
made previously. so-
It's in here.
Yeah, exactly, okay.
Okay, we don't have to discuss it, because that was.
No, no,
was
very
the
good,
street.
so check it out.
So the two changes, removing the word likely, which is in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraph down, second line from the bottom. And changing the word from party to owner. Page 3, paragraph 4. Those are the two changes.
Where is likely to?
Page 1,
Page 1. Second paragraph from the bottom. The town would. Says town would
Got it.
likely,
okay,
Kurt suggests we strike likely.
Wait a minute. Wait, however, the town will.
I think that's
Paul, do you
it's
now have
factually correct.
have the operative comment? Copy, do you want me to make the changes or do you?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Do you want me to make the changes or will you make them? The ones that we're discussing now?
I can make the changes, they're just two minor edits. Okay, let's have the motion again.
Move to approve the minutes with two minor changes not to be released at this time.
I have a second.
got a second.
Okay, roll call vote. Start this way, Kurt.
In favor, aye.
Pam.
Yes,
Richard. Gary.
Aye.
Carl.
Aye.
Gary.
Aye.
And Paul, I is unanimous, so that those minutes are approved. We will not release those. I will make those changes and hold for the, for future vote on releasing them. Okay. So let's now turn to, the risk assessment folks. So, would you like to introduce yourselves,
sure.
again?
Nancy Nevins with Associates. I am a principal in LSP. And I'm here with my colleague.
I'm Ariel Neiman. I'm a senior scientist and human health risk assessor with RO.
And we're here to present our draft findings of the human health risk assessment of the site, assuming remediation has been completed. So the bulk of this presentation will be, unfortunately, or fortunately, presented by Ariel, so I'll take the lead on that. Feel free to, I think we're all comfortable with questions as we go, as opposed to waiting to the end.
Yes, yes, please interrupt as we go.
Yeah, so just, one, as he's not only presenting the results, if you can talk about the, so the status and where you are in the report and just the whole progress. And I know there's another conversation you'll be having with EPA
We have an EPA meeting next week.
next week.
Yes, that's correct. In the meantime, we're in the process of preparing the draft report.
And the purpose of that meeting with EPA is just to make sure technically that
We're on the
everybody's on the same
page.
page as far as
So to
methodology.
speak. Yeah, yeah, and to the extent that there are questions, deeper dive that you might want to go into.
Okay,
They just made some few minor changes, so do you mind if I share my screen?
well, do you want, I'll stop. So, yeah, you share yours, if you have the latest version.
We had a deadline established for the draft report to the town. Can't remember what the date is at the moment. We have established July.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're just getting put in place for when we will provide that.
Paul, for you, question.
Yes,
I don't know if I heard your question. You referred to the report, as if remediation were complete or, okay, so you're leaping forward in time.
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to be clear, okay,
Once the remediation, the rod remediation is complete, what are expected use of the property?
got it, okay.
Or I should say, not use receptors.
Yeah, just, if I can interrupt, just some background for those who are kind of new to the pieces, so, Rue is hired by the town, with partial assistance from the state for the Mass DEP Technical Assistant Grant and other funding, to support their work, and the purpose was to support the task force and specifically the whole reuse, part of our charge. And, so logically, it's what's the site going to look like when it's ready for reuse in terms of risks and not only the contaminants of concern, but spatially in different areas of the site. So that in the future, whether that's part of our work or in the future, things could be sited in different places, understanding the risk or lack thereof to various receptors. And you'll discuss what those receptors are. So with that, I'll stop talking. Go ahead.
So, as Paul alluded to, Rue was hired by the town to evaluate the 2229 Main Street properties. Anticipated post remediation conditions and the risk that would be associated with utilizing the site for various purposes. I'm going to discuss the draft human health risk assessment results. But first, we need to give a little bit of background on the human health risk assessment process. So I know we have a lot of different backgrounds in the room, and hopefully that'll provide a little bit of context for the results when I present them. So I'm gonna call it risk assessment 101, and I'm gonna try and go over it quickly. So we have exposure. You know, how is someone exposed? Where are they exposed? How long? How often? To chemicals that may exist on the property. We have toxicity, you know, what dose of a chemical will result in a response from the body? Is it cancer? Is it a non-cancer result? And you need to have both exposure and toxicity to end up with risk. Now, what is risk? We're looking at the incremental estimated risk of exposure at the site. One of the things when we think about exposure is conceptual site model. So there's two different visuals that I have up here. One is more like a flow chart, the other is pictorial. They are getting at the same idea, which is, you know, trying to understand the sources, the pathway, potential for human exposure. You know, EPA and Maximus have gone through, you know, this at length, and we're kind of taking the last bit to look at the future of the site. And this informs both the risk characterization and risk management decisions about property. So one of the things that we think about is who is exposed. You know, property is very different if it's a solar farm versus residents. And, you know, if you have residents, you have children, you have adults, they're present 24/7, they're inside, they're outside. You have a construction worker, it's an acute, very, you know, short-term, high-intensity exposure to soil. You have, you know, indoor workers, they're indoors breathing air all day long, but maybe not outdoors. So think about all those pieces. Someone have a question? Okay. We also think about where does the exposure occur? You know, do we use different parts of the property differently? Do they, you know, have different qualities that would make someone be exposed to them differently? When are we looking at the current conditions, as you alluded to, or future? In this case, with our risk assessment, we are looking to future site conditions, what we anticipate them to be once remediation is complete.
Did you say we could ask questions as you went?
Absolutely.
Once remediation is complete, what's your definition of once remediation is complete? And at what point do you anticipate that remediation will be complete? And as a legal matter, when will it be determined to be complete?
I can't speak to the legal matter. However, what we are considering complete for the purposes of the risk assessment is the soil has been taken care of. And, you know, the cap is complete. And there is, there are institutional controls on the property for groundwater, which is a longer term, monitoring and, process to fully clean up. You would like to-
So, we've learned from Karen Bruce that EPA, when they complete their remediation plans, they will issue a SWARUS, site-wide, this is site ready for reuse, basically exactly. And, the owner or the potential owner can't use the site and develop the site till that has happened. So that's EPA's statement. That
Is that when
remediation is
you,
complete.
in your vernacular here, when you're using that term, you're referring to something that will be finally determined by EPA, at which point it's remediated in your judgment. Is that right?
We will outline in our report the assumptions that we make, and we'll check with EPA on if, on where those align or may not.
Okay, and do you have a time frame? I mean, if the institutional controls are in place, they haven't been negotiated, can you just ballpark where we're looking?
I think I've seen things of.
You're asking
I don't know.
remediation, complete remediation?
2020.
When will remediation goals be met?
I don't think depends on time, Pam. I think it's independent of time. It's just assuming when the remedial action is complete as determined by EPA, institutional and engineering controls are in
okay.
place.
So-
So that's kind of a distinction, that's a regulatory
Okay,
distinction.
so this is floating out there, and once remediation is complete, this is indifferent to time, you're saying?
Essentially, I mean.
Is that your,
water
you
has
agree
to-
with that?
It has. It's dependent on the achieving certain clean goals of the site and when those are achieved, you know, we have considered. We've made a lot of assumptions. One of them is that soil remediation goals have been met and that remediation has been complete. So at what point in the future that is to be determined by EPA and others.
Yeah, really, thanks, everybody.
And well, and more specifically, EPA has told us that their plans and their estimates by the end of 2027.
Yeah,
The
years.
site will be ready for reuse. That could change, but right now they're on that.
It has been in flux,
What's that?
and that date has been in flux in.
Well,
You know.
this is the latest. It could change from that. And so right now, the best that we know is that by 2028, the site will be ready for somebody to reuse.
So we're in a
That's-
time machine here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really, thank you, everybody. and that's
Yeah,
really
but yeah, that could still be in flux. And between now and then, there'll be a number of people, including the successor committee and the 2229 Main Street Oversight Committee and Rockwell's committee, they'll be still monitoring that remediation. So the town will have eyes on that process. Fan,
So you're
Fan
still
will have-
talking about the groundwater remediation happening well after the cleanup is complete, is what you're talking about.
Yes.
You're talking about conditions that include groundwater
It's a
remediation
ongoing.
still happening.
So that's, the pump and treat goes on forever.
Yes, right, that's an important distinction, is we're not, this does not assume that groundwater is clean.
Absolutely, right.
But the site will be ready for reuse independent of the groundwater process.
That is correct.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's one of the key assumptions is that there's an institutional control to prevent consumption of groundwater.
Absolutely.
Correct, right.
Everybody follow that? So yeah, it's.
We will touch upon a lot of the things we just discussed as we get further along, but
And if I ask a question that's off the wall, just say that you're off the wall.
no, it's always good to answer questions.
Okay.
So circling back, we also think about, you know, how does exposure occur? You know, does someone you know, inhale or ingest or you know, touch the media? So when we have chemicals, we have to say, well, what chemicals are present and at what concentrations? You know, do we have data that we know is representative? Can we, you know, make assumptions to calculate what an appropriate exposure, you know, might be? What from these chemicals that we know that are on site, you know, could they be ambient from a background source? compounds that are present in concentrations that are in line with expected background in an area are not included in the incremental analysis, which is what we are doing for this evaluation. So, you know, we look at it and say, are these present in concentrations that would be there in the absence of the site?
So
And-
if you just elaborate on what incremental analysis means, I think you just did, is repeat that for,
So it is
the recording.
the risk or hazard that the chemicals present on the property, you know, pose without the presence of any chemicals that may be there regardless of whether, you know, the
So,
site
yeah.
exists. So there are chemicals in the world because we have rocks and we have metals and things in the world. And so we may have incidentally found concentrations of those. It doesn't mean that it's, you know, because of the site, or it doesn't mean that it's in, it exists in an amount that is in excess of any other place in town or in the state. So we are looking at, you know, what the site offers above that.
So it's basically what the operations have resulted.
It's been, yeah.
The contaminants caused by the operation.
Not naturally occurring circumstances.
That
Naturally occurring.
there are a lot of naturally occurring substances that we do include, but they are,
Oh, they're not.
what we are removing or not including is chemicals that are present in concentrations that are present in the background. Situation.
Background's the key,
Background.
is the key word here, is the incremental or risk in addition to whatever background risk would be posed by naturally occurring.
Right.
It's a concentration would have existed
In the
but for the operations. If the operations never occurred, what would be on the site? And, you know, there's no area in Massachusetts pristine and has metals and has other things that are naturally occurring.
Yes, and for instance, a compound that's naturally occurring that we have to consider in a lot of geographic areas is arsenic. Arsenic is present in soils, and so when we look at a site with arsenic, we have to look at what's above what would be present in background.
So it obligates you to have baseline data
Yeah,
as you
absolutely,
describe it. Yeah.
absolutely. And their default, you know, Massachusetts has put forward that some background data for certain contaminants, for some compounds, we consider zero to be background, you know, volatile organic compounds, we don't assume there's a background concentration.
And on this property, they've done extensive research into background concentrations of certain compounds in the geographic area, and we were able to look at that.
Okay,
You can establish site specific or just general, so, yeah, background's a key word.
forgive me, but I'll keep on moving you along.
That's okay.
Move along.
Thank you.
So we talked about exposure, and now we'll talk about the toxicity portion. So what are the potential toxic effects of a given chemical, and what concentration or level do we see toxicity? You know, you see toxicity at different concentrations for different chemicals, and you get different effects. Cancer, non-cancer, non-cancer effect, we may see an effect in different parts of the body. And scientists using, you know, animal studies and epidemiological studies, just like human studies, have developed factors which we utilize in our calculations to look at how ingestion, inhalation, you know, dermal to skin, how those all play together to be able to calculate this. And they build in numerous, they call them uncertainty factors for conservatism, to make sure that we're building that extra bit into our calculations.
This is a well-established process and you're using well-established values from the
Absolutely,
literature from EPA uses, yeah,
absolutely.
standard practice.
Absolutely, this is,
So if you don't have exposure or you don't have toxicity, you don't have risk. You have to have both. So when we do our calculations and look at human health risk We group by non-cancer, it's called hazard index, cancer, or excess lifetime cancer risk, or ELCR. And we group these by our scenarios, receptors, by different areas of the site, if appropriate. And we add up that risk and hazard by exposure pathways, so and across media, so soil, you have ingestion, dermal contact, inhalation, you add all those pieces up. And you also factor in target organ or non-cancer hazard, which we'll reference a little bit more later.
That's an important slide because we're going to be talking about cancer and non-cancer risk later on. That's the way we evaluate human health risk assessment, so it's important to understand those differences.
So the excess lifetime cancer risk is the probability that an individual will develop cancer for a lifetime because of exposure to carcinogen. EPA presents a risk management range in the National Contingency Plan of 1 × 10⁻⁶ to 1 × 10⁻⁴. The Massachusetts DEP risk threshold is 1 × 10⁻⁵, which is what we selected for this risk assessment in line with those.
So that's translated into 1 in 100,000 chances of cancer due to exposure from that site. So that's the threshold, that there's an incremental risk of 1 in 100,000.
And then we look at the hazard index, which is the non-cancer exposure, and that is a comparison to those toxicity values that I explained before, and it's a ratio. So we're looking at that calculated value compared to what the exposure is, and we look at based off the toxicological endpoint or the target organ to that hazard threshold 1. Chris.
So you need to meet both thresholds in order to have acceptable risk at a property, at a site.
So transitioning into what were we tasked to do here? So when Drew was hired, we had our conversation, said, what are you looking for? And we were asked, what can we do with the property when remediation is complete? So how do we answer that question? We anticipated what post remediation, as we discussed the definition of that before, conditions would be for soil, groundwater, sediment, peat, and surface water. We identified the most sensitive site use, and we considered what reasonable maximum exposure scenarios would be. We're going to go into these points a little bit more as in the following slides. So this figure here, it shows anticipated post remediation sample locations. And we're very thankful we worked with EPA, Maximus, and Bailey and Aldrich to derive a data set that is represented with what you see here. They put a lot of work into that. We're very grateful for their assistance. You can see, hopefully, that there are a couple of areas with high density of locations. So like, for example, the 2 spots in yellow in the northeast and the southwest. Those areas represent locations where remediation is already complete. So that's a lot of the post-excavation confirmation sampling that is represented there. You can also see that there is a distribution in a grid pattern across the site, and that gives a good example of the just kind of general delineation across the property. There are some areas, particularly by like the landfill near the Spacken Bog, where the old buildings are, where there's a little bit less sample locations. And that's from a combination of things. This data set represents data through December 2023. There's a big push for some additional sampling in underneath some of these buildings. And these are also areas where remediation is planned to occur. So as I'll talk on the next slide, we've built in assumptions in our development of exposure point concentrations based off of this knowledge.
So the each dot represents the location sample where either remediation is complete or where remediation is not needed. So this represents at least the current picture of what it's gonna look like after completion of remediation. And this data will grow as cleanup is.
It will absolutely grow, and there will be, this is representative of data for soil and sediment that is anticipated to remain on site. And accessible. So a little bit more about, you know, kind of how we developed our data set. So the soil and sediment, as I said before, it's representative of site conditions that are anticipated to exist once remediation is complete. So it's soil or sediment that's going to remain on site and be potentially accessible. For groundwater, we utilize this only for modeling potential indoor air exposure. We made an assumption that planned institutional controls will be in place and will restrict groundwater use on the site for potable and non-potable use.
So can I ask a question on this, but drawing from the last slide? So
Yes.
you had a wide variety of locations where the soil had been tested, but if the assumption is that where they found any kind of contamination, it's going to be removed, you're saying that the data set now assumes that even though there was testing there and there may have been contamination, it would now be clean? If that's what the remediation calls for?
If I'm understanding your question correctly. So this data set only includes sampling locations that represent soil that will remain on site. So it's soil that, based off of the current data, is clean or. Just I have to say.
Yeah. So we need this information, Gary, knows for our report. But this isn't the last of the story, you know, whether the town decides to repeat this in 2 years or 4 years, you know, is, you know, with additional data for more insurance, that's kind of one of the decisions. But, you know, the assumption will be that.
No, I'm just trying to understand how the data set was constructed on which the risk assessment was based. So they had these sampling sites, but this was sampling for what exists or what was sample. I mean, you can't sample for what the post cleanup soil will be because
Correct.
it's cleaning.
You're right, and so we made assumptions regarding reaching the remediation cleanup goals in specific areas and based off of you know, resulting calculations for the compounds as are appropriate given the status of remediation activities in the different areas.
So as an example, for PCBs, the cleanup goal is 1, correct?
Correct.
So everything above 1 is removed, but the remainder is actual data. So there could be PCBs of like 0.5.
Correct, and our assumption in the risk assessment as a conservative measure is that the exposure point concentration someone may be exposed to is 1. It's not going to be 1 because that's not how the map is going to work for that particular compound, but it is a conservative assumption given the information that we have.
And using these data are far better than just taking EPA's cleanup goals and plugging them into every site, right? Because this is real information.
Now, maybe just break one area, go through like the northeast corner. That remediation has been complete.
In that one area,
In that
that
one
small
area.
area, yes.
So you can see the number of samples in that area. So we can calculate an exposure point concentration for all of the contaminants for which there are cleanup goals established, right? So you could actually use site-specific data to calculate an exposure point concentration in that case.
Right.
In which case, it needs theoretically is going to be below and is below the remediation goal for a compound for which there are remediation goals established. So in that case, concentration will be lower than the remediation goal because you have actual data that you could calculate and compare it to, right? It's a little different in a case where the building footprint is where we don't have post remediation data there yet, right? We have to make assumptions about what those post remediation concentrations will be. And that's where we do rely on remediation goals for the compounds for which they were established. So we're using the data differently in different places. But I'm trying to rely on the site-specific data
Right,
as much as possible.
and we have a lot of compounds that are analyzed for on the property. So there's a lot of compounds where we don't have remediation goals. And, you know, utilizing the actual data for those compounds is important in when we're looking at a cumulative
I think that's
exposure.
a really good point and something we talk about remediation goals often, but there are dozens of compounds for which remediation goals are not established. So in those cases, we have to calculate exposure point concentration.
And it's not saying anything about those driving risk, but it's part of the process
Right.
to include everything that, you know, is looked at just as a matter of.
That's the process is accumulate risk.
Okay.
Yep. I'm sorry, go back on slide, thank you. So we also have, you know, heat and surface water. We used existing data where we could and where remediation is anticipated, we used the standards which we expect to be applied there. And we were able to develop exposure point concentrations that are conservative estimates of the anticipated average chemical concentration in each environmental media. So we looked at each of those calculations. That's Chris.
So, to say the groundwater, you only care about the volatile organic compounds that are in the groundwater, because nobody's drinking the groundwater. So if there's uranium in the groundwater, if there's 1,4-dioxane in the groundwater, if there's PFAS in the groundwater, if there's beryllium, if there's copper, those are not part of your calculations because those are deep underground. No one will be exposed to them if they're not drinking the water.
Correct. Our evaluation was limited only to the footprint of the site and assumes that there are institutional controls that no one will be drinking or otherwise exposed to the groundwater through like dermal contact.
So the inhalation is really only these few obscure volatile organic compounds.
Well, they're not really obscure, but they're the volatile compounds, that which are volatile and will come in through the subsurface into the structure of the building, and therefore we potentially inhale. You're not going to have, you know, beryllium in the subsurface be volatile. You're not exposed to it via infrared. You might be exposed via dermal or ingestion, but not via.
I mean, we're getting deeply into the weeds, and that's good. I'm gonna get a little bit deeper into the weeds on this issue, because I think you're right. You're looking at volatile compounds, the possibility of vapor exposure and inhalation. But one of the institutional controls is you don't use groundwater. The other one is if there is inhalation risk, EPA will mitigate that through this one, number 6, will mitigate that if that's found to be a case in reality.
Right.
That would mitigate it by EPA.
And one of the
And
assumptions,
that's basically, you know, if you got radon in your basement, you have to kind of check it out. It's like radon mitigation. Look at different types of volatile.
right, and our assumption is based off of data that we have today. You know, we're talking about potentially building buildings many years in the future. We can't speak to what concentrations are going to be then, or what the risk of, you know, vapor intrusion may be at that point. That'll be evaluated then, but as of right now, based off of the data that we have today, and we'll speak to that as we get closer.
Okay.
So we looked at risk assessment scenarios, 2 main ones. One is residential across the property for, you know, any area where there's soil, with the exception of a holding basin where there's going to be a canopy. And recreational activity in areas where there is sediment or surface water. And recreational includes, you know, a resident, so it's a child or an adult who lives on the property, or a construction worker who's redeveloping the property for residential use. Go ahead. This is a pictorial, shows kind of where each of these are on the property. So we have the orange hatch in area 1A, 1B, and 2. These were divided based off of media and remediation status as it currently stands. We also have area 3, which is the white hatch, and those soils are going to be rendered inaccessible by the engineered barrier. And then we have area 4, 5, and 6. So our evaluation of 4, 5, and 6 as recreational is extraordinarily conservative. Area 4 is, yeah, I think the general thought is it's stormwater retention. It is extraordinarily unlikely to ever be used for recreational purposes. And, area 5, Stagnum Bog, is a very sensitive area. Also not a place for recreational purposes. However, including them conservatively in our evaluation just kind of bolsters the protection of the unit.
So are you assuming that somehow or other or kids can paddle around in the bog, or are we just talking about walking past?
We are talking about wading in.
Waiting, oh, okay,
So wading in sediment and surface
in
water,
the stagnant bog.
in the stagnant bog, yeah, along the edge. something like
Probably
that.
isn't gonna be a lot.
And you're
It-
using that model because that's the most exposure you might see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you pick the most exposure that you might see as a recreational user of these areas that are not supposed to be trespassed on at all.
Mhm.
And
Well, it depends. I can't imagine a use like that would be something that someone would choose to allow, but from my perspective, when I think about what is the possibility. It's a conservative possibility.
I did a lot of things when I was a kid that my parents didn't know and wouldn't have allowed me to do.
That's exactly the case,
Fair enough.
and you could put signs, like, don't wait in the cooling water pond.
So it doesn't, so the concept of an attractive nuisance, which this would be,
Right.
is answered by the institutional controls, which are designed to stop kids from being attracted to the nuisance, which is perhaps naive, but also the best we can do, right? Is that kind of what you're thinking? I mean,
but
that,
you're taking into account that they're going to actually be exposed there anyway.
Exactly.
All of the risk calculations assume that the resident could potentially wade in that stagnant bog.
And holding basin too.
And the holding basin.
So a kid who likes to go dig around in
Yeah,
holding
so it's
basins,
still-
like to
it's
catch
still-
rocks. with-
yeah.
You mean the.
Not the
Not
holding
holding basin.
Yeah.
Not holding basin.
That's what I'm making there.
So look, I mean, area 2 here is really important because, plans would be to have trails connected to the town trail around the box. So there will be people walking around.
Dogs running in the
Area
bog,
2.
yeah.
And in flood stage, it could be wet, and somebody could take off their shoes and it could happen. So,
Area 2 is actually residential.
We conservatively assume residential. That is protective, when we talk about a resident. That's protective of recreational activities, trespasser, which is, someone who's ignoring your signs, saying keep out, commercial industrial worker. And when we talk about construction worker, that's protective of a utility worker. And when we talk about, an abutting resident, that's also protective of a recreational user who may be coming from further away from the property. So we build those protective mechanisms into this.
but residential assumes a longer exposure.
Longer and
It's
more.
unlikely that to trespass or recreate,
Yes.
If there's no unacceptable risk for a resident,
right?
all other scenarios are
Right.
also acceptable. Because it is the most intense longer term exposure.
In all the maps that we've used for reuse, we've considered area 2 to be conservation land. And they assumed an even more conservative exposure right there than
And
just conservation land.
And to account for the fact that you are considering that it's not going to be redeveloped, we also looked at the soil in different intervals, assume that it's not going to be mixed up. So a lot of times when, we're developing our assumptions on what chemicals someone would be exposed to. You know, we think about, well, if someone gets in there and redevelops it, and you dig the soil up from down deep, and you end up with it on, you know, on the surface, that's what someone might be exposed to. You know, what is your worst case scenario? In the case of area 2, we did that evaluation, but we also evaluated it, assuming that the soil that is shallow will remain shallow. And it doesn't really matter for the risk in this case, but we did do the evaluation just to.
I mean, in general, so looking at future reuse, the areas most likely to be developed and reused is 1A and 1B here. But the others, that could be incidental or recreational.
Right. Right.
Passive recreation, okay.
This is general exposure for an on-site resident. All these pathways do not apply to all areas of the site, but it gives you an idea of what we looked at. You know, for example, you know, we have soil. Someone could be exposed to soil from 0 to 10 feet or 0 to 2 feet. They'll be exposed to soil through dust in the air, and they could be exposed to soil through homegrown produce. They have their garden. And how does that enter the body? You know, ingestion, dermal, inhalation, or through, you know, the radionuclides through external exposure. And you know, to your point about groundwater, you know, we looked at that through the potential for vapor intrusion into indoor air, and that would be an inhalation. Go ahead. This figure and table shows that, you know, the exposure for the resident in areas 1A, 1B, and 2 are all very similar. You know, we evaluated that 0 to 2 feet, you know, assuming the soil in area 2 stays shallow because most of the remediation is complete. We assumed that in area 3, we didn't evaluate any comments because the Rucker cap will sever all of those potential exposure pathways. And we have, you know, sediment, surface water, and peat in areas 4, 5, and 6, peat just in 5. So this is a large table.
The most important slide, the smallest.
I know, it's so hard to get all the
It
information
is.
on one slide, and so many things that I wanted to be on a slide that people would see independently of my words. So we're looking at, you know, the residential receptor and the construction worker. Those are the 2 primary receptors. And we're evaluating the resident for, you know, exposure to soil in the individual area, as well as sediment and surface water in a worst case scenario. So like the highest concentration in each of the areas with sediment and surface water, and peat. Those are all cumulatively added up to look at the incremental cumulative risk and hazard for exposure in each of these areas. Some of the additional assumptions we touched on before, that vapor intrusion mitigation systems are in place for areas 1A and 1B. Based off of the current groundwater concentrations, you know, modeling suggests that that would increase risk beyond what is acceptable. So with vapor mitigation systems in place, that's not a concern. Area 2, we screened for that, it was not a concern. We also assume that a Rucker cap is going to sever all exposure pathways for area 3, and that municipal water is used for tap water in these properties.
You've talked about a number of conservative approaches, to look at the most sensitive receptors. I think the other conservative approach, which is kind of standard, is cumulative risk.
Yes.
Because you're not just looking at individual chemicals, you're looking at the addition of multiple chemicals in the same risk calculus.
Correct.
So
Multiple
that's
chemicals.
That's a very important.
Multiple chemicals, multiple pathways, you know, different exposures across the site. You know, we're assuming that someone is living on the site and recreating in the sediment. And, you know, there's some double counting of exposure in that because of the way that we assume people may ingest or interact with the sediment and soil. So there's a lot of conservatism built into these calculations, and that's also standard.
Can I just be clear, in one A and one B,
Yes.
which is where we would build housing or structures,
Mhm.
you're saying that the risk exceeds the threshold unless those structures have, you know, vapor intrusion control systems. I
Currently,
mean, the
yes.
fact that there's 10 feet of soil and we don't let anybody go deeper than 4 feet or something, that's not good enough.
It has to do with how we model the potential for vapors that are off-gassing from the groundwater, how that may travel
So
through
it
the
can
soil
travel
into
through
the
more
building.
than the, you know, whatever we require be left, you know, of the 10.
It can travel hundreds of feet. I mean, it's an issue
Okay, that's,
everywhere.
You're making the assumption in that case that those vapors are not gonna be there forever, even though the pump and treat system is eventually going to get rid of them.
Yes, we have to assume with the data we have today,
It's gonna be the data in 100
and
years.
this, you know, unlike with the soil where we have something specific, we don't have, you know, a timeline or something that we can point to say, you know, this is what it will be when we reach this particular threshold where you're allowed to build on. So the assumption at this point is that a vapor mitigation system is in place. When or if it comes time for that, that is an evaluation that can be redone and reevaluated.
So in 4 years, when the remediation is complete, if you did sampling, you could reevaluate that, the need for a vapor mitigation system to reduce risk.
Absolutely, and you don't necessarily need to model it based off of groundwater. You can take actual soil vapor
Right.
samples, so you have more information. You know, we model based off the information we have.
The timeline for the pump and treat and the vapor extraction being taken care of completely is much greater than 50 years. It's more than 30 years.
The groundwater is a long-term solution.
Right, so it's not,
Yeah, not
That's for drinking, that's for groundwater.
The groundwater pump and treat though is very effective for the volatile organic chemicals that are in there. It's also going to be really slow for the ones that are not volatile that are in there. So that could change.
So I have an editorial comment about this, and maybe Kurt, since he's in the environment business, would agree. Modeling vapor intrusion is notoriously uncertain. It's better to have measurements. EPA does not have measurements of vapor intrusion here right now. Could they do that? Possibly. They don't have them. The good news is that even with the modeling, if it turns out to be an issue, it could be mitigated, just like radon or anything else. So, you know, it's the only way to do it at this point. Using models,
This is
but it's
actually
just-
one of the institutional controls, isn't it? That there is a,
Yeah, that's what,
there is funding for this.
Yeah,
It's not
that's
something
what I
that's
mentioned, CPA's
like
obligation.
EPA.
Yeah, it's pretty standard practice in sites like this with groundwater plumes under them. It's fairly low cost in the big picture.
so are you saying that if somebody wanted to build whatever there, that EPA would pay for the vapor intrusion control system in that structure?
yes, that's my understanding. Karen, the public comment can disagree, but I think that is the understanding. That's it's written in the institutional controls.
the institutional controls haven't been written, is that right?
Well, they haven't been, yeah,
They're in.
well, the draft stage
It
isn't there.
looks like, yeah,
Right, it looks like.
it's not, you've got to catch these things.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It isn't over till it's over.
Yeah, there you go.
Is that,
Any other questions on,
Yes.
on this? I mean, essentially, it is just kind of summarizing the last slide. So, you know, we found that there's no unacceptable risk identified for the anticipated post-remediation scenarios. Assuming the vapor mitigation systems in place and the other, you know, controls that was institutional controls we spoke about. And that risk wise, the entire property could be used for residential purposes. And those residential scenarios are protective of the other types of proposed uses.
Can I just ask for one clarification on that point, going back to the last slide, when you find no unacceptable risk for residential on 1A and 2, you are finding for cancer risk, 8 times 10 to the minus 6, but that you're saying it's not unacceptable or it's acceptable because it's below the Massachusetts threshold of 1 part in 10 to the 5, right?
Correct. 1 times 10 to the negative 5 is the cancer threshold that we utilize for this risk assessment.
Right, so it is right up to and also 9 times 10 to the minus 6 for area 1B. But so they're right up to that threshold, but they don't exceed it, correct?
Correct. They do not exceed it.
That
Yeah,
number's
there's-
never gonna be zero.
It's never, that is correct. It is never going to be 0. And based off of the way that risk assessment goes, there's actually a fair amount of wiggle room, despite the fact that it looks very close. Just based off of the way that the calculations are run.
Terry Ackerman has her hand raised. Go ahead, Terry.
Yes, Gary just asked most of my question. I just want to make sure, especially when we present this to the public. So 8e to the minus 6, that's 8 parts in 100,000, right?
A million.
Is that right?
8 parts in a million.
It's a million.
A million, right, okay. So then next to it, it says child, 2e plus 00, what's that?
That's 2.
That's just a 2?
That's just 2.
Using the same type of notation, that is a 2.
It's a non-cancer.
The non-cancer risk for a child is 2.
When it is looked at cumulatively with all of the target or, possible target organs collapsed
How do you
together.
interpret the number 2?
Yeah,
So,
I don't understand that, yeah, the 2.
so
Right.
really, there's more than can fit on the slide.
Yeah.
And
Right.
what, when we see the number 2 there, there is additional backup calculations that, indicate that, any particular, toxicological endpoint, target organ, would not be
Right.
impacted above, an unacceptable level.
Right.
Those are all well below 1.
So the threshold for the hazard index is 1 per
Based on
organ.
the target organ.
Based on
You
the
just
target
can't fit
organ.
target organs on
Yes,
this.
so you see a number 2 there, it's still an acceptable risk because it's 1, no more than 1 for each target organ. So that's why the number 2 is there, as opposed to a 1, yet there's still an
So for instance, when you're talking about the hazard index, you're talking about if I ate some uranium and the uranium got into my kidney and harmed my kidney without causing cancer, it just caused kidney damage. That's a hazard index as opposed to a cancer risk.
Correct.
And there are actually some hazards at the site that are not cancer risks
Yes.
that are there. But that number 2 is
Right.
saying well below unacceptable risk.
Correct, when we look
Right,
at.
right. So I need to figure this out because I don't, let's do the cancer risk first. So let's say it's a construction worker. So it's 1 part in a million. Is that what that's saying?
1 in a million.
1 in a
Okay.
million.
Okay, so what is the acceptable risk level? I don't remember what you said. I think it was maybe 1 out of 100,000.
Exactly,
Correct.
yeah, that's the
Okay.
acceptable incremental risk.
And Terry, it's
Alright, and
important to
then-
keep in mind it's an incremental risk when the general population has a risk of like 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 of having cancer. So it's very, very small.
Right.
And
So
so when
right
you
below
consider the
that-
population is 18,000.
Okay, one at a
Right.
time. Terry, go ahead.
Okay, so I just want to ask a bunch of questions to make sure this makes sense. So, to me, so the next line down is 9e minus 6. That would be 9 parts in a million, right?
Right.
Is that right?
9 in a million.
Okay. And the acceptable risk again was somewhere between,
So
well,
you-
what is the acceptable risk, actually? You said DEP was 1 to the
That's-
minus 5?
Correct.
Yes,
Okay, and you said that the EPA was between 1 to the minus 4 and 1 to the minus 6?
It's a range that is used for risk management decisions.
Right, so it does, I do agree with Gary, it does seem like it's right up to the limit. And when you say there's wiggle room, I think we're really going to have to be ready to explain about that.
Yeah,
so
I think we
that's-
need, no, go ahead, Terry.
Well, go ahead, Gary, I think we're saying the same thing on that.
Right, just we
Um,
need to be able to explain these things in English, like, that
Right,
the mass DEP threshold is 1 part in 100,000 or an probability of 1 in 100,000. And that,
right,
nobody has a 0% or 0 risk of cancer. It's
correct,
X, and I don't know, Kurt, you said nobody has a 0 risk of cancer. It would be nice to know what a typical Massachusetts resident's risk of cancer is, so that when we look at 8E-6, 8 parts in a million, how does that compare to anybody else's risk?
Yeah, it's
Right.
1 and 2, 1 and 3 based on gender. I can't remember.
yeah,
which-
so we don't have our risk guru here, David Ropik isn't here, and so he
Our
will be
communications,
instrumental
yeah.
in explaining.
Right.
This, but for purposes of this discussion, I think it's important to understand the methodology and the rigor of the methodology and the column on the right. And the column on the right, I think the numbers, can be kind of confusing, especially when they're written as exponential.
Absolutely.
Right.
Mostly
That-
1 in a million.
But I think
Absolutely, and all
Terry's
that-
point is valid. We need to be able to present these findings. Maybe it's just the column on the right, but I think we risk alienating our constituency if we just say
Yeah.
all risk levels are acceptable and it's based on a black box. We need to be able to
Right.
communicate the
absolutely
2
agree.
in English.
Yes, and that explanation. will
Yes,
largely
I
be-
don't understand right. So the non-cancer risk, I understand the cancer risk now, and I agree, it's right up to the line and we should explain it. We shouldn't have a black box, but the non-cancer risk, okay, so let's go back to the first line. A child is 2E plus 0, an adult is 2E minus 0, 1. What is the acceptable risk in the non-cancer?
So you look at a threshold of 1 based off of what part of the body.
What
the chemical
What
may
does that
affect.
mean?
So you may have, I'm gonna make this up here, you may have, one chemical that affects your skin and another chemical that affects your liver.
Sorry.
Or your kidney.
But I think the question
Sorry,
is,
what do you,
what's the ratio? It's a
Okay,
ratio.
can I just say, Terry, I think this has to be explained, and maybe we need another meeting. I don't want to spend the rest of the meeting going into great detail on how to explain this. I will say that somebody's characterization right up to the line, I would not agree with on that. If up to the line is 1 times 10 to the minus 5th, 100,000, you don't have numbers that are cancerous that are up to the line here. You have numbers that are fine.
no, but you have the EPA one, which was a range of 1 to the minus 4 to 1 to the minus 6. But I agree, I don't want to take up your whole meeting, I just want to understand, I don't understand anything about this non-cancer. When you say 2 versus a threshold of 1, can you just explain what that means?
Okay, I'll give you 2 minutes more, then we have to move on. Go ahead.
I think she wants,
Okay,
I think
thank
she's not so much the target organ, but what does 1 mean? One.
What's the ratio?
Yeah, it's the ratio.
So the ratio is based off of, what do we assume someone may be exposed to in terms of a concentration? And what toxicity that chemical may, is anticipated to result in. And we look at the ratio of those to look at a non-cancer.
What would that number look like if it was toxic? if you said, boy, this is a level that's toxic, what would the number be?
Well, you mean, the toxicity value, like,
Yeah.
or the.
The HI.
The HI, the non-cancer.
The non-cancer, what would the number look like?
It would be above one
For
For
one
an
particular organ.
For one organ?
for one organ.
So for
This
kidney, for
presents-
example, would be like 10.
What, yes, like 10, or I think from the baseline risk assessment, some were at like 400.
I think the job of this group is to figure out what is the level of capacity of the public to be able to gather on this. This is very, very.
This is in the weeds, this is in the weeds and inside baseball.
But
for
this is a
group.
great conversation
Yeah.
because we have to find a way
Yeah,
to
this is,
take people
understood.
to a comfort level that is far more rudimentary than the one that we're operating. This is really fabulous and really wonderful, but I think what it's telling us is that remember who the audience is.
that's the next step. I think for us, it was getting the science right and presenting the science according to protocol. And the next piece is how to present that.
Well, and so
Yeah,
a lot of
I-
that comes in.
Yeah, so I think you're right here, Penny, you're absolutely right, and so it's one thing. Rouge going to have to explain in their report, we're gonna have to explain it in our report in a way that is understandable. For me, it starts with this column on the right. So it's accept, what does that mean, it's acceptable, we work backwards, we don't work from the exponentials on, we work backwards, how did you come up with that? What are the assumptions, and are they believable, and what data they're based on? But I don't want to overwork this here, but I think you all agree that this is complicated and it needs explanation. There is, I want to move on because for the public meeting next week, there is a slide that I prepared that summarizes this at a level I hope the public will understand. It's not this, and which captures the right-hand column, but not, in words. So I want you to sit here and as we go through this, the slide presentation, we need to, because the last time I did this, it was draft. It was because I had met with these guys, I said, this is what I think, how to explain it in one slide. I'm not sure we're gonna agree on that, but for the public meeting, we need to start explaining what the results are
Makes
here.
perfect sense.
And at a million foot level, 10⁶ level.
But it needs to be based on the science and the rigor, and that's what we're here
But
to present.
I think at some point we have to just say the baseline is, how does this compare to, what would otherwise happen without, somebody didn't live on this site.
Or a neighbor who's not sitting on the site and somebody on the site, their risk
It's
is
the
cancer
incremental
is 1 in
risk.
100,000
It's the incremental
more
risk.
than that person.
He's not here, I'm gonna depend heavily on
Yes.
David Roby.
Yeah.
For
Yeah,
script
exactly.
translation and working with these guys and moving forward. Last comment, Bill.
So I would love to see though in your final report, a little box that describes a real world example of how you get the hazard index for a particular chemical on the site. So that that's something somebody can look through. I think that would be very valuable for people who are really confused to be able to say, oh, this means, this for this site. As an example, there's.
Okay, well, I want to end.
I'll consider.
I'd like to end this by saying, you guys have done this is complicated, fabulous job on your work with EPA, you're gonna meet with them next week. I think this is, it's as realistic as you can get, given where we are, and we're projecting into the future. It has to be credible and, it more depends on EPA cleaning up the site to these standards. But if they do, I think this risk assessment is quite well done and appropriate, so I want to thank you for doing that. Our work on this is not done, Pam, we're gonna have to explain this and integrate this into the reuse work stream, although I think given the column on the right side, it almost strikes me that
We're open to almost any.
reuse is probably not limited, probably.
Exactly.
Yeah, probably not limited,
One more. So compared to other sites that you've worked on, how do you feel
No,
how
can we-
fulsome is
think-
the
I think it's-
data here?
I need to stop the discussion unless you want to be at 10 o'clock tonight.
Well, I was just,
I don't want to be here till 10, I think we should move on.
Yeah, this-
well, no, I was just saying, there's a lot of data at this site for you to work from compared to most sites, right?
There's a lot of data.
could we stop sharing and Thank you. Please sit here and.
If I could just say, I think the fundamental thing that I didn't understand was if the threshold is 1 and you're getting a 2, that sounds like it's above it, and it doesn't sound acceptable.
Well,
Does that make
phrase
sense?
it like this, 1 per target organ. So
Okay, you heard Terry, we need to explain.
It's very complicated,
It is.
very, very complicated. And we can't dumb it down either. That's the other thing. We have to make sure that we give what we can give to the audience in the best form we can, convincing them that we have extremely competent experts upon whose expertise we are relying. And realize the limits of what, it's like you don't go to a doctor and say, tell me everything about kidneys. I mean, you take a little bit based on the, we've got to do that sort of thing here. This is very complicated.
It's also very difficult to distill down to one
Yeah.
slide. This is something that is meant to be in a report. And the context that is provided in that is incredibly important in the entire process. So
Maybe you can persuade people that you are experts who have demonstrated the capacity to be delivering very complicated material, and you have to find a way to write it home in a way that doesn't make it too rudimentary and respects the complexity of it,
It's a
which
challenge.
is what they're doing.
It's a challenge. We have to do that in all of our work. We have to do that on the legal side as well.
Absolutely.
It's the
Yeah, the whole.
Goldilocks report, right? Just right. Good.
Anticipating what we might hear next week. I understand the data analysis to be yours. How do we answer the question, data sources? De Maximus, EPA, combination of the two?
and Haley and Aldrich.
Okay, I think that's important to let people know that this isn't RU data, this is RU analysis.
absolutely correct.
Okay.
We collect.
Well, it's all
data.
EPA. It's the Maximus, it's Haley and Aldrich.
Right, but I think it needs to be part of the story,
Yeah.
albeit briefly.
And Rue is working for us, with that,
Absolutely.
not a consultant for EPA, right?
Correct. And we largely followed the protocol used by Haley and Aldrich in their baseline risk assessment, so we tried not to stray from that.
Yeah, I mean, we went into it with our own minds and our own approach. And then we're able to, reference what they have done based on their knowledge of the site and, utilize things as appropriate. But, we went into it with, our own knowledge of the risk assessment approaches that are acceptable in the world. And I don't disagree with what they did. But just, we didn't copy that.
Yeah, no, I didn't even say, we just did what they did and plugged into the language, no.
Yeah,
But we looked at our assumptions and then looked back at theirs and understood where we differed and where we didn't.
Yeah.
And made sense of those differences.
And having a tag grant and having RU work to the town, independent of the task force, independent of EPA. I mean, it's reassuring. It's not entirely EPA's approach, and I'll discuss that next week, but it's not terribly dissimilar. Since the reuse work stream is the immediate client for this information, Rich and Gary, are you okay moving on at this point, or?
Yeah, I mean. I have a problem understanding how the risk is characterized for non-cancer. I mean, my takeaway for reuse on cancer is that with controls for vapor intrusion, you can do pretty much anything you want on the site 1A and 1B and 2, although I don't think anybody's contemplating that at the moment. I don't fully understand how the risk is stated for non-cancer problems. I'm assuming the bottom line is the same, that it, is quote unquote safe for any use with control of invasive organics, but I'd like to understand that more fully.
I'm always happy to have a conversation.
Okay.
I mean, what I like is a one pager on the non-cancer risk I mean, what does it mean? I don't know what a 1 is. I know what 8 additional cases per million are, but I don't know what a 1 is.
Just building on what he said, I feel like from all of the other work streams perspective, this answers all of our questions. We can proceed and do what we want. I feel like from David Ropeek's perspective, from a public communications perspective, we have a lot of work to do, because if the members of the committee are having trouble understanding what this means, the public, forget it. But from our ability to do our work, yeah, it's only that one right-hand column. Acceptable risk, we can move forward, but the public is going to have more questions.
Yeah, I agree completely. So, I understand from the professional scientific point of view, their conclusions are that the risks are acceptable. Once you get into explaining that, you got to figure out how to do that carefully and credibly.
Yeah,
Come on, we're gonna.
contract will present, what this hazard index of 1 means, and so all of that will be laid out
Okay,
in the report.
Carl, did you have a question? I saw your hand is raised. Are you okay?
No, right, I'm just making that same point, that then we have to be able to clearly explain to the public what the non-cancer risk measures mean. In a way that's intuitive and understandable to the public. Everyone's making that point. I just.
Yeah, and I think it starts with the ultra conservatism of the assumptions, Billy, then you have to explain the numbers. But, anyway, could we move on to the public forum? Let me, so, I'm sharing this, so on the public forum, just a couple of things, that's next Tuesday. There have been some internal publicity. I know that the administrative assistant for the select board sent out a notice to all the 60, how many committee chairs, to disseminate that information. There's gonna be an article in the Bridge on Friday, I think. It's on the website. We don't have sandwich boards all over town. I'm hoping that there's good attendance. There is a site visit tomorrow. One of the reasons is the reporter from the Bridge wanted to go on site, take a few pictures. She has written her article. I haven't seen it yet. And I told them the highlight of the public forum is from my perspective, the most important message in there, but we'll see what she writes. She has very good questions, and I'm confident that's going to come out okay. On the mechanics, we're going to be at 7 o'clock here. I think I prepared this slide deck, and I'm not going to charge you all for not doing your homework, but I asked for any revisions or extra slides. Having seen that, I know Pam had some comments here that we're going to talk about, and I think Rich had some comments. I'm assuming that what we have here is largely correct and or appropriate, not correct. We'll go through that tonight as quickly as I can. I intend to present this probably from the podium and then go as quickly as we can into discussion and questions. If the format of the meeting, I think, is going to be similar to the last meeting, unless there's a lot, if we have a lot of people, we can break into work groups on different topics. We'll make that kind of decision on the fly there. It might be appropriate, but the purpose is really just to update the public and where we are and not to talk about our recommendations, because we haven't deliberated yet, but sort of more of our findings where are we, Rich?
One question about whether we should say it or not, what we just agreed around the table here, that the risk analysis does not preclude any of the possible listed uses of the key portions of this. Do we want to say that next week, or do we want to be careful not to say it?
Hold that thought till I get to the slide. Because I think we have to say something.
Well, that's my feeling.
Yeah, we have to say something. I think we will. So, I did the last, when we talked about this, you guys, I had pulled out a lot of background slides on the site and a lot of history. The comments were maybe put some of those back in there because maybe people didn't remember or the people new to the site. So, this is the agenda. It was a follow-up to the previous hearing, an update on progress and then ask for input. I do have, just a couple of slides on the site. I have added the proposed 40B development, just the site and the surrounding properties. I had the slide in here. I think this was important, since I'm doing a little update on the site itself. You know, it's really less than half is really developed, and there are areas that are never used, and half is still undeveloped and wild. I don't know if you think this is appropriate or not, but I think there are comments on, you know, the history of the site. Now, there are a lot of words on this. I used it at the last meeting. I think it's really interesting, but whether we want to spend some time on this, it kind of takes you back to the operations. The designation of the Superfund site, the abandonment by StarMed, when EPA's record of decision was, when they decided on cleanup goals, when the town approved the warrant article for the select board to acquire the site. And this is the wording from that. And then the consent decree, and then, you know, we're beginning our work. This is a lot of information, and I think it's worth the time, but, you know, any comments on whether it's too much information, I can just skip the whole thing.
No, I think the timeline is good. I think rather than replaying the whole town, the whole town meeting article, I put that in a separate slide. If anybody says, you know, well, what did we approve? You can pull it up, but that makes that slide
Yeah,
a lot easier to read.
good read.
And the odds are most people aren't. Oh, yeah, the town said, you know, yeah, the select board can acquire.
Okay.
I would add to that, the words residential standards might be significant to not drop out
Well, I think we can say that in terms of,
somewhere.
yeah, but I agree, but I think that can be in the discussion. Well, it's there for two thousand.
It's there on the 2015. residential standard.
Cleanup plan is to a residential standard.
Yeah,
It's just the thing that looks like the mattress tag. at the
yeah,
bottom.
I'll take the box back.
You've still got your residential standard in there.
So I'll leave that in there. I thought this last time was interesting that the town has had eyes on this site for a long time, in various committees, you know, we're sort of the current tail end of a long process. And yeah, I want to acknowledge other committees and the crew and people who started this all. So that's, as far as the charge to the task force, I just, two bullets here. First one is the purpose, to recommend with the town should acquire the property. But the reality of it is that we're gonna recommend only whether or not the select board should move forward towards acquisition. To indicate negotiation further planning. I think we won't be in a position either with the select board to actually acquire the site at the end of our work. But whether we're gonna suggest or not for them to be on the path. I just, you know, this cleans up the charge slide, but I think, I didn't want to leave it whether we're gonna recommend to acquire the site or not, because we're kind of probably not gonna do that.
Is
Per
it
se, right?
Well, I mean, we're
pursue acquisition?
Pursue acquisition or,
pursue
rather than-
acquisition.
Because there are still steps,
yeah, well,
right?
yeah, pursue acquisition, move towards and pursue.
Yeah.
Yeah, should move, you have moved.
Yeah, the select board should move.
Yeah.
Just a typo.
Just the type.
Yeah.
Yes, should move towards
Okay,
acquire acquisition.
you guys could have emailed me this type.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's good people remember.
Can you go back one slide for a moment? I'm not necessarily in favor of the thumbs up, thumbs down, because it implies that this is just a binary yes or no. And although we're not gonna recommend what happens, we are gonna lay out some supporting rationale.
Okay.
Yep.
You veto my clip art, that's fine. I agree.
I mean, I also think the two bullet points are not necessary. It's a distinction without a difference. I mean, if we recommend to acquire the site, the next logical step is to move towards acquisition. I don't think we need to say that you know, okay, we're not, obviously, it's the select board that would move towards acquisition, acquire, all of that, not us. Our job was to make a recommendation, and I don't know. I just think you can save words here.
Okay. We can take that out. Kathy, you comment?
Yes, I saw your 3 scenarios that you folks had,
That's I have the slide coming up. You want to hold off till I show the 3 scenarios?
okay, but just one thing.
Yeah.
One of them is not to acquire the site.
Right.
Okay, so this says to acquire the site.
Whether the town should acquire this, whether or not. I mean, that's what the charge.
Whether is a yes or no.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're not gonna change the
Okay,
charge.
all right, sorry.
Point well taken, but I think
I'll
it's gonna be
hold
okay.
on.
And
Okay.
this is a direct quote from the charge.
Yeah, that's the only part of the charge I'm putting in here.
Okay, that's the point.
Going back, I think this is important that this has been a team, the task force has had support from town council, from the technical committee, from RU and from EPA. I think this is important. There's been a lot of investment of time and effort in the task force and beyond that. So this is my multicolored Venn diagram. We were organized into the 4 work streams. I think your comments were a little bit on methodology, and we can't go deeply into the methodology of the task force, but I think these are important bullets. That we've had dozens of interviews with town departments, committees, private parties, developers, contractors. We've had conversations with with Massachusetts town officials who have faced similar challenges. Extensive work by town council, independent work by RU, funded by Mass DEP. The reuse group analyzed strategic plans and plans as they were available from other departments. Hundreds of hours. This is your point about
Yeah,
man.
man hours is what,
Hundreds of
person hours or hours.
okay,
Hours will do.
Hours will be fine, just get rid of the man hours.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And, we've met 25 times. We had, maybe this is 26. This is all I have on sort of the intensity of the research. So what we have learned, I just have one or two slides on each piece here. I started with the reuse. I flipped this around, Rich and Gary. I started with the reuse piece because I thought probably that's of most interest to the attendees, that, there was a master plan concept that had been developed earlier. And the current thinking is building off this common set of uses. That this conservation area, pollinator meadow on B, which is the holding basin, transportation node along Route 62, and to widen the town trail corridor next to the conservation
Can I
node.
interrupt for a second?
Sorry?
May I interject something here?
Yeah.
This, I'm just reminded of a conversation we had way back where we wondered whether leading with reuse was actually the right thing to do here. That conversation was extensive, and I guess we all concluded, I thought that was a really good point, and why are we starting with an assumption on something that is really big part of the question that we're grappling with.
In headlines, a yes to the question.
Exactly, and that was, I think you made the good observation way back, and we talked about it at length, that it does headline an outcome. And I think we really need to think about it. I mean, it may not be as sparkly, but it is more logical to lead by the developmental experience of creating all this information, whether it's risk or legal or whatever, and not leading with some assumed outcome.
Yeah, so the two choices here, one is legal or reuse.
It doesn't have to be legal either, but I think leading with an outcome is a little bit peculiar.
And maybe we can approach it in a different way, and that is the question had to include, were acquisition to be sought, why? Meaning potential uses. So just put a big caveat around it if we lead with this. That is, to your point, it's not intended to imply that the report has been written and there's the recommendation is to acquire. Nonetheless, that is where we seem to be leaning, and, tonight's data doesn't, interfere with that.
Although if you look at the next slide, it's pretty clear that that includes non-cooperative.
So maybe if we hit it on the next slide, we will, quiet those voices and say, why are
Yeah,
we
yeah,
here?
I hear you, but, you know, it's pretty clear that one big option is don't require
Do you need the slide before it? No?
Maybe this one? No, no,
It's
it's
just treading on ground.
great. Yeah, that's a good point. Probably don't need slide 7. Whatever it is,
Yeah.
13.
that, I think deals with your problem.
But again, is it
Yeah.
the one you're talking about first?
Yeah, you can just start.
Let's start with
Translating now.
No.
Yeah. So this has the four scenarios. I'm not sure I ordered them exactly the way you ordered them. Kat, this is your point. That there are 4 overarching scenarios. 2 of which the town acquires. 1 for municipal purposes, 1 facilitating some private use. And do you want that revenue generation parenthesis there or not?
Well,
I don't think it's.
You want it, and should get.
yeah,
You say I've been influenced by it.
I mean, I know people are interested in revenue generation, but I think there's, you know, as we discussed in the reuse group, there is strong interest in a affordable assisted living facility.
So maybe it's net generation, I mean, there's.
Yeah,
Some-
which
some
might
uses
not generate revenue,
Cost.
but might solve a problem.
Maybe potential instead of equals. Potential.
Or take it out completely.
But I don't think you need it. We're at a very high level in this slide.
I don't think I need it either.
Yeah.
Doesn't add anything to it.
What happens,
I can mention it.
what happens to courts caveat thing, what happened to that?
Well, if
If we get rid of that other
if
slide.
we get rid of the other slide, then we're starting with, these are the potential options before us as we understand them today.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's any ambiguity on this group about it.
Oh, I see, private actors in the town chooses not to buy
Right.
a site. So both are, okay, or no private, maybe there is no private acquisition. And then there is a possibility,
There-
and then it really sits there.
And we know that
There are
the
5
would like not to hold it.
Yeah, but the title is reuse scenario. If nobody acquires it, there's no reuse, so maybe we're
Yeah.
getting circular here. The bold face, just being fussy here, are they the same, the municipal and the private? The private seems bolder and
I think they're exactly the same.
more prominent to me, maybe that's just my eyes. All right, never mind.
Me too, that's what's going on there.
And then I added something that basically. If you blow up the scenarios and I want to have some specific possible uses, municipal use, examples of. The town acquires it, these are potential municipal uses that we've done research on, that there are needs, and. If the town, if there's a private development that could lease parcels for housing, assisted living, et cetera. I just wanted to add some color to this slide.
Could you make that legible by making 2 slides, municipal acquisition, possibilities include, and then your list. Private, your possibilities include 2 slides, and you can get through them quicker than the 1 slide that will require a lot of talking. Because I think the bullets kind of speak for themselves very nicely.
Yeah.
Paul, I would just go back on the prior slide, just as a minor point, but just to use the term master plan concept and not master plan, because we really didn't put together a master plan, so
Master concept, you like better?
master plan concept. Like you have on the prior slide.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So there, I think all of it, there are 2 slides for legal. And there are 4 categories. There's sort of And this is sort of what we've been discussing, this is sort of all public information.
Just on the. Tonally, I wonder if we're a little too exuberant. But just on one point in the first bullet on liability protection, and this, I don't have the answer here, but including new contaminants discovered in the future. Multiple means available to protect the town from new contaminants in the future. I don't know for sure how far that, how much prevention, again, under what circumstances we have to have demonstrated a kind of continuing due diligence, and what happens to contaminants the EPA subsequently puts on the considered the hazardous substance. I mean, I just personally am not sure about that statement, and I worry about over exuberance on our part with respect to you know, our exposure.
Which you
And I don't-
think it's including new contaminants discovered in the future, you think that's?
I think we should pull, I wish I could refresh my memory and stuff, but I don't know under what circumstances we can say categorically that we're protected.
Well, I mean, I'm caveat this whole thing, this is all subject to negotiations, right?
Well, but then I think we have to be, I read these as being, for the uninitiated, saying, we've got it covered, everybody. And for example, insurance policy will guard against future liability created by the town uses. Insurance policies for Superfund sites are notoriously sometimes ineffective. I just think we need to be very careful to not oversell this, and that doesn't go to anybody's position on acquisition or not. It goes to the question of how we talk about how one gets to an acquisition pathway. And I just want us not to create a slideshow that says, don't worry about it.
I want to communicate with our findings and what we found, and I think everything on the slide we've heard, we found, there's not.
Insurance policy will guard against future liability. I don't.
But doesn't say all future, that's what insurance policies are.
Well, the
right?
tone of that, maybe, I don't know, am I wrong?
What if
about
we
this,
soften
Chris?
a little bit, maybe insurance policy may guard?
Yeah, that kind of stuff, anything
Or
like that, I mean,
multiple means. may
For
be
insurance
available.
policy is a tool to guard against future liability.
I didn't hear that, but.
Or maybe something like from operations, you know, undertaken by the town. I heard the legal analysis to say you can get protection from contaminants not yet identified that are traceable to the prior,
Right, traceable.
Yeah.
traceable to
And
the
that
prior.
would be the issue with something
Yeah,
that
that's-
we're not looking at right now.
Yeah, that's kind of, I think just, I think it's very appropriate to hedge a little bit on something as difficult.
That's fine.
For example, another one would be, there, once cleanup goals have been achieved, the site will be as safe as surrounding areas for reuse.
Where are you looking?
I'm looking now down at safety, I'm just jumping ahead a little bit.
Don't jump ahead.
Okay, I'm not gonna do it. I'm just gonna make an overarching comment that there needs to be sufficient caution and hedging so that the public gets a real picture of complexity, uncertainty, and our inability to divine future contamination and outcomes out the distance that we might want to. It's not, I have no objection to
Yeah.
the fundamentals here, but a word here too, may, as far as to the extent that we now know. Things like that, Paul, we just,
Okay.
because as written, what struck me was, hey, walk in the park.
I think-
And it's not.
I think the points are well taken, and I think, not being quite so bold, and declarative also makes sense, still say this. So for example, multiple means are available to towns from liability. Nuancing a little bit, that it's not signed and sealed, that Concord can walk away from any responsibility.
It's actually fun editing to do this kind of thing, because it really makes everybody feel so much better when you can.
So, okay. do the editing and send me the edits.
Okay,
Okay, right, so
yeah, and I apologize for not doing it sooner,
Yeah, that's fine.
no, it's not.
Any
I
kind of,
called you this afternoon and I
No, no.
felt bad about it, but.
it's fine, but on May 7th, we had homework.
It's just a
I don't feel
matter
like
of,
like a teacher here, but, you know.
so the basic comment though is, we should not request a categorical, and the overarching tone looks a little too rosy to me.
The people who want confidence may get more than we're trying to convey, and the people who are very cynical are gonna perhaps fault us for being overly assuring, so we wanna.
And I also think that, a member of the public would say, are you kidding me? Safest surrounding communities, this is freaking soup front site, and we'd have to answer that, And I think we were gonna have trouble answering some of those things if we keep them at this.
The next couple of days can get me, send me.
Yes.
Edit if you want. I did, so this is the slide. Yeah, okay, so let's take these one by one, right, so over here, Rue Associates has performed a reuse focused human health risk assessment. True? Yes, I hope. The focus is what will be the residual contamination, like exposures at various areas of the site, and what will be the risk to people living at, recreating, or constructing at the site? Okay, that's kind of the three bullets of that. Does Rue agree
On
with
that
it?
second bullet, I would say after cleanup.
What
I mean, you
was
said
it?
what will be the residual contamination? I would just be clear after cleanup.
Okay,
Well, the word reuse,
Yeah,
it's implied, but maybe not as clearly as it could be.
okay, got it. Findings, okay. Read it.
I think those,
Hmm?
I think we should soften no incremental risk.
Oppose, no,
Insignificant,
acceptable,
acceptable.
To the
incremental.
extent that I mean,
Yeah.
It's not no, because we know.
We
that
just
they're
went through that, there
quantified.
is an incremental, right?
It's small, but it's.
can you tell us, you two, what you think the hedging words,
I think Kurt was very appropriate in his two word choices,
which were.
will,
you
So-
mentioned acceptable and you mentioned insignificant. In not really applicable here, but language which someone may hear in Massachusetts. Surrounding, the Massachusetts contingency plan is no significant risk.
no, that's,
So it's not completely applicable, but mirroring that language, could be useful.
Yeah, well, that's helpful, because you can point to it.
Yes.
So instead of no incremental risk, it'd be no significant.
okay, so,
Should we add anything to, to then,
where,
based on their knowledge or something, to head to that?
significant risk,
Yeah, that'd be better, yeah.
we're going to incremental, so.
Well, there is an incremental increase in risk, right?
Yeah.
I think incremental
Along
is getting
the
at the
threshold,
method, not the result.
Oh,
Incremental is kind of getting at the method, not the result. It's no. What was the terminology? What was the term for that?
significant risk?
No significant risk.
No significant risk and no unacceptable risk.
Mass uses no significant risk.
Okay,
It's
Unacceptable terminal standard.
Yeah,
So it's not directly applicable, but. Maybe mirroring could be useful.
And again, it's based only on supervised contaminants from legacy operations, which is a limitation, right?
Based off of the. Analysis which has been done to evaluate legacy operations. There are contaminants that are included in our evaluation that were not considered.
give me, look, let's go, remaining exposed in areas of the site that can be used. Get that, will,
Will pose no significant
there's
risk.
no significant risk
Maybe end it there.
based on super. I'll just leave it at that.
Can you start it out by saying? No unacceptable risk associated with remaining exposures in areas of the site? Or? Because no significant risk is a term of art in MCP and. will not really define, or not really appropriate under
Yeah.
superfund, but the word, I mean, you would use lowercase in the beginning, right?
Right, right.
It would be appropriate, but it might say, well, what do you mean by significant?
Yeah, I think significant or unacceptable.
Yeah.
I think either.
I think unacceptable.
Do you need to add anything like based on what we know now, or based with respect to contaminants known to be identified by, I mean, anything that is a little
So,
more.
here's what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take this slide, I'm gonna send it to you
I was
guys.
gonna say, we could spend the
To
whole day.
you
talking
and
about
to
this.
Romy.
Yeah, that's what they do, you have
To
little more
Romy, and you
on this,
Tell
right?
me, it's one bullet, and I wanna keep it at that level,
Okay.
I think getting the incremental risk assessment concept in the first 3 bullets would be helpful too.
Like go into
And
the
we don't need
second.
to wordsmith it now, but I think getting that concept in there just.
Of the increment as opposed to, excluding background.
Yeah, so maybe cumulative, incremental, risk,
Yeah.
just a couple of those terms so that.
And, yeah, all of the terms of art, which have, people write books about, you know?
Yes.
It's great.
so that's, I'll get this out, I'll get this slide. I think the last bullet is correct, once cleanup goals have been achieved, the site will be as safe as surrounding areas for reuse.
Does everyone agree with that? I would not.
It is acceptable, but I don't. I think that's a tough statement to make.
Okay,
Do you have
It-
no risk assessment?
It's,
Have
right,
anybody-
it also doesn't say anything about
let me get back there.
vapor intrusion,
You're right.
right? And
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to say with institutional controls in place.
Well, yeah.
Also,
I think
I
We
mean,
have demonstrated that there is an incremental risk.
it's not as safe, it's,
Below the threshold.
It is acceptable,
Acceptable.
but it is,
we haven't evaluated the risk of surrounding areas, so it's.
right, there's that
how
too.
can you say that?
we don't know that, we don't.
but by definition, we're saying there's incremental or increased risk of 1 in a million. So that's an incremental change from the abutting property, right? Or from
In
that-
theory, we don't know what the.
In theory.
Also,
Maybe someone had an oil
you
spill.
gotta give people a common sense, intuitive ability to think that this is a Superfund site with significant contamination.
But there's significant remediation.
Well, that last bullet seems like it's a summary bullet, perhaps for the report of the task force. I don't know if we need to commit to that right now.
Yeah.
We can just think of the findings out of it.
I stand corrected, guided, whatever, I'm gonna delegate the slide to you guys. I mean, I
Why
put
just
this
take it
together
out, take
before,
this out? Are you-
We'll work on the slide.
and it's one taking it out, I think we're deciding how to word that
Yeah.
short bullet and how to.
And just one other comment on the findings, we may just want to mention relative to what, relative to DEP and EPA standards. For sure, right?
Yes.
Because that's what we're doing. So it's not just we're making a judgment call.
Yeah.
It's based on.
Well, it's a very important slide.
It is, it's the challenge of how do you put it in one slide without having this caveat and that
Yeah.
caveat.
You know, that's leave one slide,
It's really okay.
because then more than that is gonna go into.
I thought my one slide was hard, this one's harder.
If it takes 2 slides, take 2 slides. I don't think we should be limited to 1 slide.
Well, too bad.
Okay, let me know how to express this. As far as ownership and operations. We're considering financial aspects, I think FinCom has seen this, I think this is true, Carl. As far as we were looking at costs of acquisition, cost estimates of reuse and development, but just the site preparation. Development costs are developed as part of related planning, and cost estimates of town ownership, meeting obligations, insurance, it's gonna be in our report.
Yeah.
And we have considered these aspects,
This,
if
including.
estimates to the town, if it's privately acquired. The ownership responsibilities. We are gonna come up with rough estimates of revenue generation, I think Carl will start to do that. But they're highly uncertain because they depend on what actually happens at the site.
I think there's
So
ways that can
Carl, you and Carrie, everybody take a look at these again. If you don't like them. Change them, simplify them. They have to reflect accurately what your current thoughts are, communicating to the public.
Is
Yeah.
it possible for people who are,
Wow.
people who made comments, can they send those to you like overnight? And you compile that and send it out again for more general? feedback?
Yeah, so.
Cause
Time
I'm
is,
afraid you're gonna get stuff that,
time is of the essence, so today's Tuesday. How about like tomorrow night? You send me
Okay.
edits?
yeah, do what? And then he can compile
Mark.
what he's getting
There's more of a burden on you
and
guys. to
send it
get this
out
project right.
again.
What is your view of the insurance policy statement?
Yeah, I've got notes.
Can you
myself
fix
to-
that one?
To make comments on slides 16, 17, and 18. Yeah, I think we can modify the insurance stuff to be a little bit more specific and still true. So I think right now it's a little bold.
But it isn't, the Superfund sites, insurance policies don't solve things as much as one might like to think they do, and so that is something that you can take care of. Right?
Yes.
Okay. And we're making.
Okay. So, another homework this time. Crunch. So I think, the last slide here, I just wanted to mention key future dates, which just so the public knows what's gonna happen from this point forward. Which I think is what's gonna happen. We're gonna submit our report, on or about October 31st. At that point, the select board considers recommendations. If the recommendation is to acquire the site, then the select board decides whether to move forward on negotiations. At that point, and then what happens? Then the next couple of years, there are negotiations and there's planning. And then late 2027, 28, cleanup is sufficiently complete, as far as we know. EPA issues the site work ready for anticipated use. And then 2028, the first steps of reuse and redevelopment can begin. The
I think
first
it all
steps.
depends on who becomes president.
Mhm.
I think this depends on who becomes president. If Trump wins, this thing will fly. And if Biden wins, he wouldn't waste his time on Concord, Massachusetts, when he has.
What, the cleanup will fly or the negotiation?
Trump, Trump will fly with Superfund. It's his excuse for environmental protection.
Yeah.
Well,
But Biden will not.
I think this slide, I think, is independent politics, I think, because I mean, this is a consent decree. Right?
Such a
To
big,
the extent that
US
we
Department of Justice.
Said that whoever wins honors the courts as a part
No,
of
it's just a matter of resource allocation.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
well,
So I just want to give you some sense of timing. Nothing's gonna happen at the summer until 2028, so we got time, we have time.
I
The select
think
board
this,
has time.
I'm just going on, this is a plausible
Yes,
scenario.
awesome.
would be in the next election cycle.
Do we need any reference to DEP in here? There's none.
No, the state has.
That might be a good thing for an additional slide, if a question is asked,
I mean,
what that relationship would be.
my sense, is it's gonna be a nuisance, but it's not gonna be a barrier. But that's not a very informed statement.
Well, the point is that they are a player. The-
Yeah,
The
that's my
state
point.
has an interest in it that is beyond just policy. It has a legal interest, I think. and-
Negotiate with EPA, DEP and DOJ.
Yeah, was that?
Not exactly sure who's at the table there, but why not? We don't know that.
We know we're gonna intersect at some
We don't
point.
know. We don't know.
well, there's also the last bullet there. EPA, DEP continues to monitor the site, because DEP will still have some ongoing role, I understand.
Sure. And I think that's important too, so, EPA's obligation doesn't end when the site is acquired by somebody, they continue to monitor. So, good,
Who's going to this meeting? What if one of us, like, we couldn't make it? Are we
Well, I hope
all
we're-
going?
I hope we're all there and I get through this in 15 minutes and then you answer all the questions.
Are you there?
I'll be there. This slide, implies, that there's no future opportunity for the public to weigh in any way, shape, or form, which is not our intent. So maybe, you referenced, Paul, the fact that we're gonna continue to meet, in between now and October, and every meeting is public, blah, blah, blah.
Including the review of the draft proposal.
Well, I didn't want to be that specific, but let's debate that right now. Are we going to put anything forward for more formal public comment period or not? That's a little tricky. The select board should be the first audience, so I don't think public should see a report, quote unquote, but
I'm saying more in terms of
this kind of level of stuff.
if we go through, you know, each of us drafting pieces of this. And then, you know, there's gonna be a meeting in which we, you know, mark up the combined draft, I assume. And I assume that those combined drafts would be available prior to the meeting.
Yeah, so, I think what happens after the public forum and into the summer, just in general,
Yeah,
is we're gonna have to talk about. Well, we're gonna have to start deliberations, right?
Yeah.
And I think we should deliberate before we write. I think one of the first things we should discuss is. What are our options in deliberate, what do we, you know? Is there 6 outcomes? What could the recommendations look like? 1, 2, 12, or I'd like to kind of kick that around as a group. Without actually voting on anything yet, but just kind of discussing what's the nature of the recommendations. And I think, then probably, I still owe you an outline to this report, but I've been hesitating based on, because I wanted to see how this came together. We should start writing mid-late summer,
Yeah,
but probably after we deliberate and decide where we're heading. I mean, I don't think we should write unless we know what the final recommendation is in its detail, because I think whatever recommendation you make is gonna be a detailed recommendation, it's not gonna be thumbs up or thumbs down. It's gonna be thumbs down because blah, 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 blah. Or thumbs up and here are all the issues, so. I do wanna start after we get past the public forum. Now, as far as public engagement. I agree, I think we should invite public engagement. We have an email, we have a website, I think the public can get us. David still is keen on engaging the public, I wish you were here. So it's not gonna end. We do have at our schedule a final public hearing forum, but that's probably to present our results. It's not more input, it's, you know, probably is right after, right, to explain the report. But I want to talk to Terry and the select board to find out how they prefer that sequence to occur, because they're the customer. Well, I should say that the very similar slide deck I'll be using, when it's finished, I'll be using to brief the select board, although they will read the select board probably. Terry and I will choose 1 or 2 slides to focus on, I'm sure. With that, Terry has her hand raised patiently for a while. Go ahead, Terry.
So, great meeting. I want to thank all of you for a lot of really thoughtful and hard work on this. I have 3 comments. I do agree with the comments that we don't want to oversell it. That helps the skeptics complain about things. That's not what we want to do. And I, in particular, didn't like the wording multiple means available. I think we need to get rid of that wording because I talked with Chris Carmody for over an hour about the insurance options. And I'm not convinced that we have multiple means available. I think we need more research. So let's not be over exuberant and oversell it at this point. That was my first comment. Second comment is the reason I was asking that question about if the non-cancer threshold is 1, but the actual risk is 2, and I don't understand it. I think it's very important, absolutely crucial, that your whole committee really understands the science. You don't have to put it in the slide, but you guys all and me, we have to understand it. We're gonna get this question. What does this mean? And we need a backup slide to explain it. Not in your regular slide, but a backup slide, and we need to all really understand it. And then
Can I
my,
just- wait, Terry, can I just say something here? I mean, there is a limit to this is really complicated stuff, and I think that we need to come to an understanding among ourselves. You know, when do you hold them, when do you fold them, when do you try to answer everything, when do you say, you know,
Right.
this is why we have experts. This is
Right.
why we have experts, and we can get back to you or whatever, but I think would be ill-considered for us to try to quote, understand the science. The science is, you know, we can take courses on each one of these words that were used tonight on this. I think
No, I
everybody would
agree.
be.
No, I
Yeah,
agree,
so-
yeah, I think you're right. My 13-year-old grandson has been sitting with me and he's asking all these really good questions. And I mean, it's like, but if you can get it to a basic level, like the threshold is 1 and the chart says 2, an average person can understand that. We just need to make sure we understand it. And maybe not even for Tuesday night, but before you finish the report, we need to understand enough of it to explain an elevator speech to a person.
Exactly.
It's definitely not for Tuesday night, we can keep that very high level. It is definitely as part of our report, we're gonna have to have
Okay.
explanations in the report.
And it will be part of our work.
And your
Great.
report, right.
That's
great.
you know,
You
question
can
comes,
take it
you
to
just-
still,
you say, please.
And it is, we have to talk about, it's highly probable that your report becomes an appendix to our report.
Right. And,
Absolutely.
and just finally, I think I heard you say, Paul, that we may need to repeat this sampling in 2 to 4 years. And is that what, did I hear you correctly?
Yeah, EPA monitor, Kara has a hand raised, I'll ask her, but EPA monitors the site. Every Superfund site has a 5-year report, so they will continue to make measurements at the site to make sure that the remediation is, you know, is as it should be in the future,
Right.
and that nothing new is discovered, yeah.
Right, but we won't need to necessarily hire Rue or another company again to verify it, or we can decide that later, or just so at some point we're clear on the process.
Yeah, no, that's not an obligation, what the town decides to do independently. Yeah, it's open, let me just, you mentioned a couple of things, one, multiple methods. That multiple method was not on insurance, the multiple method was on liability protections. And the multiple methods of liability protections pertains to part of the negotiations, the bona fide purchaser, the multiple layers of liability. So that's, I'm not overstating that, that wasn't related to insurance, insurance is a.
But I think the point remains, the one on Terry's part, that it tonally, it could be adjusted a little bit, because there are several tools in the toolbox, comfort letters, but, you know, all that stuff, but the way we spin it is very important.
Yeah, I just want to assure the public that.
But I think Terry's making a very good point on that. I mean, the tone of that, I think, could be rationed a little bit back.
Well,
Yeah.
okay. Okay, it is factual that the multiple methods that are available for liability protection, it's not an opinion.
No, but I don't want to go there further, but it's total.
Okay, thank you for that, Kara. Comment?
Yes, I have a couple comments. So one, I'm happy I kind of logged into this meeting ahead of time tonight, because, you know, as Rue pointed out, EPA and Maximus provided Rue with all the data that they used for this study, and spent a lot of time gathering that data set and sending it in. And so I was a little surprised, also based on our earlier conversations, that EPA did not get any preview of this information prior to it being released in this forum and in this meeting packet. Yeah, I think one thing that we discussed earlier that was really important was kind of running through all the assumptions on, you know, what we passed over to Rue, and most importantly, that everything is being transferred information-wise from what is in the design plans into what's being done at the site, and that's all being properly reflected in the risk assessment. So clearly EPA has not had time to review this yet. We have a meeting set up for next week with part of the task force and with Rue to walk through this, and we'll have comments following that meeting on the risk assessment process. But again, just kind of frustrated on the timeline because we put a lot of effort and resources into providing this information, and we were not given the kind of support back on the other side to review it ahead of time. In addition to that, I think it's really important that, similar to a lot of people said, you don't dive into these risk numbers until they're fully understood by the committee and reviewed again for consistency with what was provided for data and what's being completed on the site, that you're not kind of putting out numbers for the risk assessment. And lastly, just my last comment is just for reference to it. So it's an EPA lead site, not a Mass DEP site. So even the future obligations to the site are through EPA and not through the state.
Through EPA and not DEP, you said.
Right.
Correct.
Oh, yeah, it's very helpful. Yeah, okay, good, yeah.
Karen, no, thank you for the comment. The timing is completely on me. Because the reuse group was to finish their work, was dependent on Rue's work. This is all draft, and there's no report written, and everything that's, it's all draft. The slides that are posted on the meeting packet, they're all draft. So we want to be transparent in what we're doing, but it's not final. So this time, and if there's
Paul, if I could just add to that, and also, Carol, this is a product owned by the town of Concord. It's not an EPA report, and it can conflict with EPA's findings. That's fine. The EPA can make a statement on the task force report or this report from Rue. That's totally fine too. But to be clear, and be clear to our audience and people at home, the town has engaged Rue to do this report for the benefit of the residents of the town. It's not a report for the EPA. So I just want to make that clear.
Correct. And I completely understand that too. It's a really hard, just making sure that, again, there's a lot happening at the site. A lot of data was transferred, and making sure that all those assumptions are maintained. Like, I mean, just looking at some of the initial images, I see data points on there that I say, wait, those data points don't align with what's going on at the property and data that we have through the date and such. So, just a consistency check to make sure we're all dealing with the same information and using the information in the correct way.
And I think that's the key. It's not even the methodology, it's not even the findings. We have to be using the same data. I think that is the universal the piece here,
But also, I mean, it speaks to the dynamism of the entire process and how we have to be careful not to overstate our certainties about a lot of stuff, because things are changing all the time, data is changing. And we just need to be very, very, very mindful of the dynamism of the interactions and the science going on here and the knowledge we're gaining from the site every day.
Okay.
Yeah, but by the same token, Kara, we are, appreciative of your efforts and the Maximus's efforts to make all this data available, and, it'll make a better product for for Rue's report and the task force. So, we have appreciated your cooperation and your work on this.
I mean, look, I'll be frank, the delicate balance here is, we don't necessarily have alignment of interest, but we're operating as a team. We're dependent on EPA's support, but we're making our own determinations based on that support. So we're very grateful for that, but it's an independent body. And Rue is independent of the task force. So layers of independence here is really important. And transparency. So.
We all want to EPA though as the buck for in the entire process, and I think that the teamwork is important.
Okay, any other public comment? Any other task force comments? If not, we have a forum, 7 o'clock. I suggest you get there a bit early, keep our fingers crossed. we have good attendance, and I'm sure I'll have a perfectly edited revised slide deck to talk about. I'm not
I
going
have
to
a
see.
bag of
I'm
these
not going to
words
see
at
this.
home.
Yeah, I always, this group has never been hesitant to give me feedback and
Are we moving to adjourn?
Bring it up.
Public comment.
There was the public comment.
anyway. With that, meeting is adjourned and see you next Tuesday.